a number of events occur during the Gilded Age that allow for industry to grow. One is going to be natural resources, not just the discovery of natural resources, but the new ways to use natural resources and the new way to obtain those natural resources. For example, black gold or oil. In 1859, a man named Edwin Drake used a steam engine to drill for oil in Pennsylvania. This will lead to what is known as the oil boom. Iron ore is also found in abundance in America. It is dense metal but soft, so breaks easily. They had to figure out a way to use that. They saw it as something that could be used in construction, but it was just so soft that it broke, and they had to figure out a way to fix it. And that was in 1850 when a British manufacturer named Henry Bessemer figured out a way to remove the carbon, which made it break and made it soft. By removing the carbon, it formed steel. This new process became known as the Bessemer process. And after the Bessemer process, steel just was being made like crazy, and this becomes known as the steel boom. New uses for steel included things like barbed wire, the farm equipment, especially by McCormick and John Deere. The biggest customer, though, of steel would be the railroads, but it did allow for these innovative construction, like in bridges, new types of bridges, larger bridges. So really, you have the oil boom, the transformation of iron ore into steel, and then the steel boom that allows for a lot of new things to be created in the United States. A lot of inventions make way for change in the United States during the Gilded Age and the Industrial Age, and as industry was rising in the United States. One of the most famous inventors was a man named Thomas Edison. He's the first to have a research lab in Menlo Park. He becomes known as the Wizard of Menlo Park. In 1880, he creates a light bulb that is functional and practical. He also needed a power source, though, for that light bulb, and he created it. He was also going to create a power source for the light bulb as well. And he's the first to provide electricity to Lower Manhattan in New York. The light bulb, though, is going to be really important in that it allows for a safe alternative to things that have been used in the past, like candles and kerosene. You also have George Westinghouse. He's going to invent air brakes that will be used in trains, and also a more efficient electrical supply for the new electrical devices that were being used in the United States. Industries grew, and people started to invent things to grow with those industries. Swift and Armour were in the meat packing industry. They would butcher the cattle, but they needed an efficient way to transport the beef without it going bad. And so they invented a refrigerated railroad car to transport that beef. New lifestyles, you have the invention of the telephone by Alexander Graham Bell. Because of the invention of the telephone, you have instant news and telecommunication with people now. Women start to work in the workplace, and you also have that growing urban population. If you look at this graph, you can see the rural, which would be the country and not city, is starting to get smaller. As you see in the purple of the graph, the urban or the cities are getting bigger. The late 1800s, early 1900s was definitely the age of the railroad. The railroad was able to be built through a series of land grants. Because the railroad was crucial for settling the West, government made huge land grants and loans to railroad companies in order to complete this railroad. The Transcontinental Railroad, which would connect the East Coast and the West Coast, was completed in Promontory, Utah on May 10th, 1869. It created a national network of railroad. And at the start of the Civil War, there were only 30,000 miles of railroad tracks, but by 1890, it was 6 times greater than that number. The railroad had good parts, it had ugly parts. When it came to the railroad allowed for ownership of land, adventure, a fresh start for people, but also the people that built the railroad had very harsh lives. In 1888, 2,000 employees were killed and 20,000 were injured. So the building of the railroad was definitely not a pretty picture. Because of the railroad, you also have the creation of standardized time and the time zones, so that you could have a schedule and a train schedule, and everyone was on the same time, and you didn't have different schedules at different railroads. And so you have the establishment of standardized time. The railroad led to a lot of new opportunities in the United States, new towns and new markets. It promoted interdependence, so people were depending on one another. Towns began to specialize in products. For example, Chicago was known for its stockyards, Minneapolis for its grain. You also had people that took advantage of the growth of the railroad because the railroad influenced industries. You have a man named George Pullman. Because this railroad track could last a long time, he invented what was known as the sleeping car so that people could sleep in the railroad. So George Pullman will invent the sleeping car. In order to build these sleeping cars, he created a company town. In 1880, he built a factory to build the sleepers in Illinois. The town provided the needs of the people, brick homes, and you had one window per room, a doctor's office, an athletic field. And to those that had lived in these slums and these tenements, it really did seem like almost Disney World to go here. But as we go further in the course, we'll find out that they ended up not being as happy in this company town as Pullman had thought they would be. Scandals also occur because of the railroad. You have the Credit Mobilier scandal. The Union Pacific Railroad Company would give subsidies to help build the railroad. Or I'm sorry, they would get subsidies from the United States government. And subsidies is just money. The government would give them money to build this railroad because the government felt like it was going to benefit the United States in the long run. The Credit Mobilier then created their own construction company and charged 2 to 3 times the actual cost to the Union Pacific. We saw this when we talked about Boss Tweed when he built the courthouse in New York, and the contractor charged $10 million more than what it actually cost, and they would get a kickback. So these Union Pacific stock shareholders would get this kickback from the building of the railroad, and they would pocket that difference and pocket those kickbacks. In order to stay out of trouble, because it was with government money, taxpayer money, they would sell stock at very cheap prices to government representatives to stay out of trouble. Now, not everybody was super excited about the growth of the railroad. Some people resisted this change. If you look at this other perspective, while the railroads captured the imagination of most 19th century Americans, there were those who didn't get on the bandwagon. One writer raged against the smoke-belching iron horse and the waves of change it set in motion as vehemently as his character, Captain Ahab, raged against the white whale in the sea in Moby Dick. Hark, here comes that old dragon again, that gigantic gadfly. Snort, puff, scream, great improvements of the age. Who wants to travel so fast? My grandfather did not, and he was no fool. So not everybody liked the railroad. They saw it as ruining America. But we see this today. I just want you to kind of think and reflect. Why might people resist change? Then think, why might they resist the railroad? And think about new technologies today that people may resist. Cell phones, driverless cars, Amazon's new drone delivery system. Why do people not like cell phones now? Just think about those things, and it will give you perspective on why sometimes people don't like change.